All right, Eric. Today we're talking about motivation, and well, let's start off with like, what's your definition of motivation, and how do you teach that to the people you work with?
Yeah, so motivation is essentially like how into the sport you are. How
Hmm.
excited are you to go and train and compete? When you wake up in the morning, are you like jumping out like, yeah, we got practice
Hmm.
today? Or are you like, oh no, I can't believe we have practice. This sucks. So, how into the sport you are, how excited you are about doing the work. But it's not just that. It's not just how you're feeling going into training or going into competition, but it's also your ability to maintain this positive outlook throughout the practice or throughout the competition. So I'll give you an example of, let's say, a tennis player. We'll call him John, the tennis player. So you can tell that John is motivated because he's excited to go train, right? He's got that positive attitude for training, that positive attitude for competitions. You can also tell that John's motivated because he seeks out challenges. So when John goes to practice, he's trying to find the toughest guy on the courts that he could play against. When he goes to a competition and he gets matched up with somebody else who is a high level tennis player, he gets excited. And he's like, yes, finally, I get a good match. So he seeks out these challenges and he's excited for the challenges. John also persists when he's faced with adversity. So if he's down in a match, if he hasn't scored the last 4 points and he's on this little skid in the match, he's able to keep going and keep trying his best and putting as much effort as he can into the match. And then the other thing is that he performs up to his ability level, you know, on a pretty consistent basis. Obviously, there's always some probability there that bad performances happen, but in general, he's able to perform up to his level. And so, motivation helps you going in, and it helps you to do the hard work that's necessary in order to be successful. But
Hmm.
it also helps you within the match, within the practice of just putting in that effort. Another thing that's really important with motivation is to not over rely on motivation. And a lot of athletes, a lot of coaches put too much emphasis on motivation. You see on social media, there's a lot of motivational speakers and people who have accounts that are spreading motivational information. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's all great information. But it's important for athletes to understand that motivation's not always going to be there, right? You're going to have these ups and downs. Some days you're going to wake up excited to train. Other days you're going to wake up and you're just not feeling it. Especially now, the weather's starting to change. You got winter coming. It can be really hard to get out there and go for your runs when it's 35 degrees outside, right? So motivation's not always going to be there, and that's okay. When I work with athletes, I try to help them to understand that consistency and discipline are more important than motivation, because there are going to be days when you don't want to do the work and you just have to say to yourself, I don't give a damn. I'm going to do it
Hmm.
anyways because I know that I need to in order to achieve my goals. So it's important to look at motivation and do what you can to boost your motivation when you're feeling low. But at the same time, you got to understand it's not always going to be there. That's okay. When it's not there, you need to lean on your discipline and your consistency, and that's going to give you that energy to put the work in and get it done.
So talk about discipline and consistency. So define discipline, and what that looks like, and then over time what that means.
Yeah. So discipline, I would consider that to be doing what you know you need to do.
Hmm.
A lot of athletes, they kind of hide behind this, oh, coach, I didn't know I was supposed to do that. Or, oh, coach, I didn't know this was off my diet. You know, right? Most athletes, even young athletes, high schoolers, they know what they should be doing. They know what they shouldn't be doing.
Hmm.
Discipline is just doing what you know you should be doing, whether that's at home in terms of your diet and your recovery, your schoolwork, whether it's in training in terms of your effort and your attitude, how you treat your teammates, how you treat your coaches, whether it's in competition, right? You know what you're supposed to do. If you're disciplined, you're willing to do it. No matter the discomfort or the other emotions that play into it, you're just going to do the work, right? Consistency is how regularly can you do that work? And when you start, if you're able to establish consistency over time, that's when you see these compound gains, right?
Right.
So in finance or accounting or math, there's compound interest and this grows over time. It's the same thing in skill development with sports. If you're getting 1% better every day, then over the course of the year, you're going to get a crazy amount better. It's something like 35 times better than you were at the beginning of the year. That's a 1% increase daily. So consistency is really important for long-term skill development and growth and mastery of a sport. And, it just takes that daily practice and that discipline, practicing that discipline every day.
Right. Yeah. I just, the guy on your shirt, Mike Tyson, I knew he had a quote about discipline. And he said, discipline is doing what you hate to do, but doing it like you love it. And
Yeah.
that's exactly what it is, right? I mean, who's more disciplined than a great boxer, a great
Right.
fighter. So it's like you said, it's capitalizing on the 1% gain each day and making yourself a lot better over time. So super.
Yeah. And I think that quote brings up another interesting point too. It's not just doing what you don't want to do, but he said doing it as if you love it.
Right.
Right. So now that's talking about what we talked about last week, which is attitude, and saying, I'm going to flip my attitude on this and I'm going to trick myself into thinking I love it. And this is where the idea of embrace the grind comes from. Right. The grind is something you don't want to do. That's not fun to go wake up at 5 a.m. and go run stairs or, get an extra lift after practice. That stuff isn't fun. But if you're able to switch your attitude on it and reframe it and get something out of it mentally, well, then you can love it and you can embrace the grind. And that makes it a lot easier to do some of these things and be disciplined with some of the things you don't like to do.
Yeah. I mean, we've all faced that, right? Where we're like, I know I got to go do this, 3-mile run today. And man, you can talk yourself out of doing it really, really easily a lot of times, right? And so, so talk about, some of the things, intrinsically. Well, I guess before we get to that, define what intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation is. And then we'll get to that question.
Yeah. So intrinsic motivation is motivation that comes from within you. And extrinsic motivation is motivation that comes from outside of you, right? So common extrinsic motivators are, winning the game, being all state, getting a Division I offer, making a ton of money from your sport, getting fame and praise and recognition. All this stuff is extrinsic motivation, and it feels really good. And we are motivated by these things, right? Your intrinsic motivation, like I said, it comes from within you, and it's more of like your passion to just do the sport. Just like when you're a kid and you just go outside in the backyard, play football with your friends because you just love playing football, right? You're not getting the extrinsic motivation. You're not getting paid or famous from it. You're just doing it for the love of the game. And that can be really good for you because it's a renewable resource, right? You can constantly tap into that and get that fuel to keep you going. So in terms of motivation, it's really nice to have both of these sources, right? A lot of athletes, they naturally go towards the extrinsic motivators, especially with society and social media. And, all this stuff just feeds into the extrinsic motivators even more. And that stuff is easy. Most all athletes have the extrinsic motivators. Those are there already. A lot of times I'm having to work with athletes to build their intrinsic motivation and to have that source that they can tap into all the time. Because a lot of times with the extrinsic, you get it. And then once you have it, it's like, dang, now what? Like once you've achieved success, maybe your goal is to be a state champion wrestler and you do that by the time you're a junior. Well, then what? Like what's motivating you now when you're a senior? Is it the same thing? You've already got that stuff. Right. So having some internal sources of motivation can be really helpful. And, it's the one thing I do with athletes a lot is take time to identify these motivators, and they'll just write down all the things that motivate them. in their life, extrinsically and intrinsically. And it's really important to have these identified so that when you are feeling like your motivation is low, you can push those buttons. And this is what great coaches do. They're able to read their team, create relationships with their team, and identify what motivates each of their athletes individually, and read their athletes and identify when certain athletes are low in motivation, and they'll push those buttons, right? You can do that with yourself, and you should do that with yourself and create that self-motivation. This is something that, Michael Jordan would do really, really well. He would fabricate scenarios. He would make stuff up in his reality to give him extra motivation. This is an amazing skill, and it's really helpful when your motivation is low. And like we said before, sometimes you don't even need to add it, or sometimes you try to boost it and it doesn't work and you're still feeling low. And that's when you lean on the discipline and you say, who cares? I'm going to do it anyways.
Right. How long does it take to, kind of build a habit, from discipline, so the way I kind of see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like you have this motivation to achieve something or to get good at something. And then that kind of you kind of have to organize those thoughts and create habits through discipline. Right. And so, what are some of the strategies, and how long does it take to make something a habit? And, what does that look like from a I guess, a discipline standpoint? You know what I'm saying? I don't know if that made sense at all, but
I'm not sure.
You mean, how do you create, like, how long does it take before something's a habit? Like, if I get up on Monday morning and I say, I'm going to go run 3 miles at 6 a.m. And then, the next day I'm like, no way, the temperature's 20 degrees cooler and I'm not interested, but like, if I talk myself into it, then I'm starting to form discipline and a habit, right?
Right.
So how long does it typically take to create discipline from, that pattern of creating that pattern of behavior, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Okay. So in terms of habit formation, the research is kind of like split on this. Sometimes it says 21 days, sometimes 28 days, but about 3 to 4 weeks of time, of consistent time, right? That means every day, to create that habit. Now, before that habit is fully built, you're going to need more discipline than after it's fully built.
Right.
Once it's in there and it's like, this is just what I do, it doesn't require as much of that, like going against the grain, friction, pushing that you have to do at the beginning. Right. At the beginning, it's unnatural, like it's an uncomfortable feeling. You're not used to it. And it takes a lot of push, a lot of motivation from your end just to get you to do it. But once you've done it and you've established that consistency, then you've created, in terms of your neural pathways, you've created a groove, right? And once you have that groove, it's easier for you to slip into that groove again in the future.
Right.
Okay. So it takes a bit of time. And at the beginning, you need to rely on your discipline. You can rely on, identifying your motivators and pushing those buttons. It might be pulling up some of these motivational speakers on Instagram or on social media and listening to those in the morning, getting you feeling excited about the run, and then you go out to run. I personally love David Goggins, and I can't listen to him for more than 10 minutes without going for a run. Like there's something about him that just hits me in my core, and he lights that fire. And when I listen to him, I've got to go, so if you identify your motivators, then you can push these buttons, and that can help you to establish the habit. And once that habit is built, it becomes a little bit easier to do it again over time. You don't have to rely so much on that discipline. It's just something that you do. Another really helpful thing with habit formation is what's called habit stacking. And this is when you stack a new habit on top of a pre-existing habit. So if you do something every single day, like, you wake up, you use the bathroom, you brush your teeth, and then you want to do something else in the morning, just do it after those habits that you have already.
Right.
because you know you're going to be there every single day. You already have the habit. All you're doing is stacking a new thing on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could use this in terms of creating like a morning routine or a nightly routine and kind of stack your habits that way. That
Right.
makes it a lot easier to do it. What people try to do sometimes is they're like, I'm going to run every day, but they don't have a set time. They're not attaching it onto another habit. And they just say things like, I'll find a way to squeeze it in.
Right.
Right. If that's what you're trying to do, you're never going to get it.
Right.
Once I get home from work, I'll try to squeeze it in. It's not going to get squeezed in. You know what
Right.
I mean? That's going to get pushed to the next day and the next day and the next day. That's just how we are. Right. So you got to make sure you have a time that you're going to be somewhere, you're going to have the time. And if you can stack it on top of another habit, it makes it really effective.
Is there a danger of trying to create too many habits at once?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Biting off more than you can chew,
Right.
and this is more of like a goal setting principle,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what you're doing when you're starting a new habit is you're setting a goal. You're saying, I want to do this thing every day for 28 days, right? That's a goal.
Right.
So yeah, in goal setting, you want to set attainable goals, realistic goals, goals that you can actually achieve with hard work and effort. And
Right.
a lot of times people bite off way more than they can chew. They haven't gone to the gym in a year, and they're saying, all right, starting January 1st, I'm going to hit the gym every single day for 30 days straight.
Right.
You haven't worked out in a year.
Right.
You know what I mean? And now you're trying to do 30 straight. Like, that's
Yeah.
hard. That's
Yeah.
really hard, even for people who work out regularly, 4 days a week. If you take somebody who works out 4 days a week and you say you got to work out 30 days straight, that's still hard.
Right.
So the challenge of going from nothing all the way up is insane. And people do this to themselves with goal setting. And what it does is it has a counterproductive effect.
Mm-hmm.
So you start going, and then quickly you realize there's no way I'm doing this.
Right.
And then you just kill all your motivation. You go, well, and what's the point in even trying? I'm not even going to do it then. So you set the goal to do 30 days straight. You end up doing 2 and you quit. Had you set a goal to do 1 day a week, you would have got 4 in that month. You would have doubled it. And that's more realistic. And then in the second month, you could do 2 days a week. And then the third month, 3 days a week. So you got to start small with goal setting, and habits are the same way. If you're not running and you want to start a habit of running in the morning, how about you start with just like going for a 10-minute walk?
Mm-hmm.
If you can't walk for 10 minutes every morning at 6 o'clock, you definitely can't run 4 miles every morning. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
So start small and then, work your way up. And a lot of people struggle with this, especially athletes, because they're competitive and they're
Yeah.
ambitious and they're like, no, I want to do it. I want to do it all. And I get that. But you got to understand that, you've got to work small, or else you're just creating these situations that are unrealistic and really hard to accomplish.
Right. What's the thinking on like creating a reward system? So like, let's say that a kid, let's bring it back to soccer. So I'm
Yeah, yeah.
gonna do 5 days in a row. I'm gonna get 1,000 touches each training session. Before or after the actual training session, I'm gonna make sure that I'm working to get 1,000 touches. That's kind of a benchmark or whatever. And so after 5 days, I'm gonna reward myself with something. Whether it's I don't know, new pair of shorts or whatever it is. Is it what's good about that and what's bad about that?
Great question. Because a lot of people do this. You see this in schools with teachers, you see this in parenting, you see
Mm-hmm.
this with coaches and athletes, right? Reward systems. This is another form of extrinsic motivation,
Mm-hmm.
right? And again, we talked about this before. It can be really valuable. And that's why people keep going back to it, because it works,
Right.
right? The problem is if you incentivize somebody, you see this in work, in the workforce as well with sales. And, if you hit this number of sales, then you get a bonus. If you incentivize somebody with an extrinsic reward, they're going to do what they need to do to achieve that, but they're not going to do more.
Right.
So that's the problem. If you tell an athlete, if you stay after practice every day and you get 100 shots up, I'll buy you a PlayStation 5, right? They're going to do 100 shots. That's it. They won't do 101. They will
Right.
do 100, and they might do it every day, but
Right.
that's it, right? So you're helping them elevate, but you're not helping them to do their best,
Right.
because their best is actually more than that, and they're capable of more. And that's where the intrinsic motivation comes in. If instead of rewarding them extrinsically, you were to help them to identify their intrinsic motivators, and they were coming at it from a space of, hey, I want to stay after and shoot 100 shots because I love this stuff and I'm trying to be the best basketball player I can be, or the best soccer player I can be.
Right.
And I just love getting the work in, and I'm going to stay after because I'm trying to chase mastery. Well, they might do 100 one day, they might do 150 the next day. And then they're
Right.
like, man, this was fun. I'm going to do 200.
Right.
They're going to keep going and see how high they can get, because they're not in it for the PS5. They're in it for mastery. They're in it
Right.
for the love of the game. So that's the big difference there with the extrinsic versus intrinsic. When you're intrinsically motivated, it doesn't stop.
Right.
Like that pursuit, that chase is endless. And you
Right.
see this a lot of times in martial arts with, the lifestyle of a martial artist. They're not in it to win championships. They're not in it for the belts or for the big fights. They're in it for this pursuit of mastery and this never ending journey, which I think helps a lot in terms of maximizing and realizing your potential.
Yeah, you make a good point. Like intrinsic motivation is going to create a higher quality most likely,
Yeah,
of a higher quality result than if you're extrinsically motivated. Um,
yeah,
yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that, like, these aren't mutually exclusive. You can
Mm-hmm.
use both, and it's helpful to build both simultaneously, right? And
Right.
go into these experiences or moments in your sport with extrinsic forms of motivation as well as intrinsic. And you might need to tap into some at certain times and tap
Right.
into the other ones at different times.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it seems like an extrinsic motivator or reward is kind of a benchmark, right? So you work your butt off because you're intrinsically motivated and you win a championship, or you know you you recognized or as an all-state player or something like that, and that's just kind of a benchmark for all the work that you've done, and because you're intrinsically motivated, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it ends up being a benchmark, but it also ends up being a ceiling,
Right.
right? So people hit that ceiling and they think, oh, well, I did as much as I could. But
Right.
really there's a lot more higher than that.
Right. Yeah. So you just have to go back to that thinking of getting 1% better every day, or I know that I'm gonna, can I today's me beat yesterday's me, or something like that. Whatever the thinking is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Cool. I wrote down a couple of those things. Yeah, I think actually we answered most of it. Um,
So I've got some other stuff I can talk about here in terms of
yeah.
intrinsic motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so like the theory that I like to use in terms of intrinsic motivation is called self-determination theory. Okay, so athletes, coaches listening, like y'all can look this up if you want. It's one of the most accepted theories in sports psychology in terms of motivation and developing motivation, in particular intrinsic motivation. Okay, and so this theory says that there are three basic needs for an athlete to feel intrinsically motivated. These are competence, autonomy, and connection. Okay, so competence is, do I feel like I have the skills or the abilities to operate in this environment, to
Mm-hmm.
take on this challenge? And if you feel like you do have the skills, if you feel competent, then you're going to be motivated to go do the thing, right? So an example is like if you're going up and you're playing the number one team in the country and you're the number 100 team in the country, you're not going to be very motivated to go take on that task most
Right.
of the time, because you're looking at your team and you're saying, we just don't have what it takes to beat these guys. And
Right.
that's okay. Like, there are just levels to sports, and sometimes they're just on a different level. And it's really hard to be motivated for a competition when you feel like you don't have the skills. Same thing with a practice. If you're making the jump up to the varsity team, or you're making the jump up to, Division 1 athletics, and you don't feel like you deserve to be there, you're not going to be very motivated to be there and to do the work.
Right.
But if you feel like, hey, I belong, I've got the skills. I can compete with these guys. I can hang with these guys. I can be a starter on this team. I deserve to be here. You're going to be motivated to be there and to do the work. So competence is one thing, and that's a lot of that is your perception, right? Because you could have the skills, but you're perceiving yourself as not having the skills, right? So that's a big part of it. The second part, autonomy, right? This is how much control do you have over your work, over your training, over your skill development, over your journey as an athlete. And a lot of athletes feel like they don't have a lot of control, and they might not. And coaches will just control everything and restrict what they can do, what they can't do, restrict how they play, not let them be free and creative.
Mm.
So autonomy helps a lot when athletes feel like they can decide how they train, decide how they play. They feel more motivated to play. And, a great example of this is Steve Kerr. He's had examples as a coach where he's let his team coach themselves.
Right.
He's given them the clipboard and he said, all right, y'all draw up the play. Now that's giving them control. That's giving them the autonomy. And that makes the players feel really motivated. So this one, as well as connection, autonomy and connection, they rely a lot on coaches, and coaches should aim to build environments that promote these basic needs.
Right.
So if you're a coach and you're listening, you should be trying to help your athletes feel autonomous and connected with each other as much as possible. And so connection is just, your relationships with your teammates, your coaches, the training staff, anybody who's taking part in your athletic journey. The more connected you feel with the people around you, the more motivated you're going to feel to put in the work, right? Misery loves company. So if you love all you people on your team and you're running sprints, it's a little bit easier because you're not alone in the whole thing. Same thing with, a game and feeling excited about playing a game. If you love your teammates, you're going to be willing to do everything that you can to win that game, and sacrifice and work hard, just lay it all on the line. So competence, autonomy, connection, those are the three needs in terms of self-determination theory. And when an athlete meets all these needs, then you can expect to see increased self-motivation.
Talk about what the effect of negative feedback has on motivation. As a coach, if you're coming down hard on one of your players, or the only thing you ever do is, kind of crap on them as a player, or you just make them feel like they're not ever going to be good enough to get where they want to go. There's 1,000 different scenarios to come up with there, but the effect of negative feedback on motivation.
Yeah, and it can be tricky here, because we could talk about negative feedback and we could talk about negative constructive feedback, right? Which might be two different things. Sometimes it's constructive and sometimes it's destructive. There's no benefit to belittling your player, to name calling, right? To making them just feel like they're not worth anything. And some coaches do this. And you see this a lot in certain sports as well. Some sports culturally accept this type of behavior from their coaches more than other sports. But I think, the big differentiator there from a coaching perspective is, are you being constructive with this negative feedback, or are you being destructive? Because constructive feedback, whether it's negative or positive, is still good. It's still constructive. Now that's on the player to then accept that constructive criticism, right? And to not make assumptions that, oh, this coach hates me, or I can't believe he called me out on this. Like, why is he always riding me? Well, was it constructive? Was it meant to coach you? Because that's part of coaching, is identifying what they're doing wrong and to helping them grow, right? So I think splitting that is important. And, I don't really think there's a place for negative, destructive feedback from a coach's standpoint. And sometimes you see this from coaches because of maybe an inability, from their point, in terms of managing their emotions, because there's a lot of emotions in sports, whether it's training or competing, and sometimes the coaches get too wrapped up in that and they let that out on their athletes. in terms of motivation, the destructive feedback is going to totally kill the motivation. No player is going to want to play for a coach, put in work for a coach that they feel like is just tearing them down for no good reason, right? They're not being constructive. They're just destroying their confidence. They're destroying their sense of self, their self-value, their self-esteem. No player is going to want to play for that coach, you know? So that's going to kill their motivation. That's going to affect their training and their competitions. Now, with the negative constructive feedback, this falls more on the player to be able to interpret that feedback in a positive way, in a constructive way, and say, yeah, you know, that hurt. That hurt to get called out like that, but he was right. I do need to get better at that. I do need to be more disciplined with that. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to use that criticism as motivation to fuel me to make these changes, right? So that falls more on the player to be able to interpret that input and use it to their advantage. The player could also interpret it in a negative way and say, man, this coach sucks and he's always pointing stuff out and, you know, criticizing me, and why does he hate me so much? That's going to probably lead to decreased motivation. So when the coach is being critical, but they're being constructive, that onus falls on the player to be able to interpret that in a positive way. When the coach is being destructive and negative, there's no place for that. That's going to have a negative impact on the player's motivation and a lot of other things as well, you know?
Well, it's important for the whole key to all of that is trust, right? And I know
Yeah.
we're not talking about that right now, but you know, a player has to trust the coach and vice versa. And all of this applies to the way parents interact with their kids as well.
Yeah, one saying I really like in terms of coaching is players don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Right. Yeah.
And so, from a coaching standpoint, one of the most important things that you can do is spend the time, invest the time to get to know your players, create those relationships, establish that trust,
Mm-hmm.
right? Create the respect and demonstrate and practice
Mm-hmm.
that respect on a daily basis, and let your players know that you care about them. Once they know that, they're going to receive your information, whether it's positive or negative, they're going to receive that in a much better way. If they don't know you care, they're not going to take your input, you know? So it doesn't matter how good of a coach you are. It doesn't matter how much you know about the sport. If they don't think that you care about them, they're not going to want to be coached by you. And this is especially true with younger athletes, high school and college. You have to spend the time to create those relationships, and that's hard work. I get that. A lot of coaches don't want to put in that work. They just want to do the X's and the O's. But this is part of coaching, is creating these relationships and establishing this trust.
What else you got? Did you bring
That's
more?
that's it on my list.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool, man. That was good. Really
Cool.
appreciate that. Hold on one sec.
Yeah.
Gotta find my cursor.
I feel like we lagged a little bit there at the